It was early morning, and the sky over the small coastal village glowed with a soft pink light. The sound of waves rolled gently across the shore, whispering like an old friend who never really left. Children laughed as they ran barefoot on the sand, their giggles mixing with the calls of the seagulls. Among them was a little girl, her hair tangled by the sea breeze, her feet covered in wet sand as she followed her father toward the boats. She was only 8, small and curious about everything. Every day felt like a new adventure beside the sea. She loved the way the wind smelled like salt and how the shells sparkled when the sunlight touched them. To her, the sea wasn't just water. It was magic. It was the rhythm of her life. Her family lived in a tiny wooden house painted blue just a few steps away from the beach. The house wasn't big, but it was filled with warmth. Her mother would hum soft songs while hanging clothes outside, and her father, a fisherman, often returned home with baskets of fresh fish. Evenings were simple. They would sit by a small fire, eat together, and listen to her father tell stories about the ocean. He often said the sea could be a friend if you respected it. She believed him completely. Every morning she helped her mother clean the porch and feed the chickens before she ran down to the water. She knew almost every shell by heart, every rock, every hidden spot where crabs like to hide. When she found something shiny, she'd run back and show her mother, proudly holding it up like treasure. Her mother always smiled and said, "You have the eyes of a seeker." Sometimes, when her father's boat returned in the evening, she'd race into the water up to her knees, shouting his name and waving her hands. He'd lift her into his arms, dripping wet but laughing. She'd touch his face and ask what the sea was like that day. He always had a story, sometimes about calm waters, sometimes about waves that danced like wild creatures. She loved listening to him. The ocean was their world, their home, their livelihood. The village was small and peaceful. People knew each other's names and doors were never locked. Children played together on the sand, and adults gathered near the docks to share tea and stories. Festivals were simple but beautiful, with lanterns, music, and laughter that echoed through the night. For the little girl, life felt perfect. She didn't dream of big cities or faraway places. She only dreamed of the sea, of growing up to be brave like her father. But even though life seemed calm, the sea always carried secrets, stories of storms that once took lives, of fishermen who never came home. The older people in the village sometimes talked about it, but the young ones rarely listened. To them, the ocean was too beautiful to fear. The little girl had heard her grandmother once say, "The sea gives and the sea takes." Never forget that. At that age, she didn't really understand what it meant. To her, the waves were friends, gentle, playful, and endless. One afternoon, she sat on a rock looking out at the horizon. The sky was clear, but the wind felt different. It was warmer than usual, and the air carried a strange silence. Even the seagulls seemed restless. Her father, standing beside his boat, looked at the sky and frowned slightly. He didn't say much, but she noticed the worry in his eyes. That night, she heard her parents whispering. The words storm and warning floated through the thin wooden walls of their home. She didn't think much of it then. Storms came and went, and that's what the sea did. The next morning, everything looked normal again. The sun rose and the waves sparkled. The little girl helped her mother make breakfast and watched her father prepare his nets. He promised to return by noon and kissed her on the forehead before leaving. She spent the morning playing by the shore, collecting shells and building little castles in the sand. A few of her friends joined her, and together they built a fortress, pretending it could protect them from the sea. But by late afternoon, the light began to change. The sky turned gray and the wind picked up speed. Sand lifted from the beach and stung her skin. Her mother called her inside, worry heavy in her voice. The little girl looked back at the waves. They were no longer gentle. They were tall, powerful, and loud. She could feel the ground tremble beneath her feet. Still, she didn't understand how serious it was. She only felt excitement mixed with confusion. It was the biggest she had ever seen the waves. Inside their small home, her mother shut the windows and gathered a few things in a bag. The girl clutched her favorite shell and watched silently. The air smelled different now, sharp and wet. People began running past their house, shouting and calling out to each other. She could hear boats crashing against the docks. Her mother held her close, whispering, "Stay near me, don't let go." The girl nodded, though her heart pounded fast. As they stepped outside, rain began to pour, hard and fast. The wind screamed so loudly she could barely hear her mother's voice. The sky had turned black and the sea was roaring. Water rushed toward the village like a monster waking from sleep. People were shouting, trying to help each other, but the waves moved too fast. The little girl gripped her mother's hand tightly, trying not to fall. The water reached her knees, then her waist. She could hear houses creaking, wood breaking, people crying for help. Her mother tried to lift her, pushing through the water toward higher ground. But the waves were wild and merciless. A sudden current tore through them, and before she could react, the girl felt her hand slip away. She screamed her mother's name, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. The next wave came even stronger, knocking her off her feet. She tried to swim, but the water kept spinning her around, pulling her under. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe, and everything was noise and darkness. In the chaos, she saw flashes and a piece of wood floating by, someone's fishing net tangled in the water, a lantern flickering before it vanished. She reached for the wood and held on with all her strength. Her arms ached, her lungs burned, and her heart felt like it would burst. The waves lifted her high and threw her down again. She didn't know which way was home or if home even existed anymore. All she knew was she had to keep holding on. The storm raged through the night. She drifted for hours, maybe longer. Time no longer made sense. Her small body trembled from cold and exhaustion. Sometimes she closed her eyes, wishing she could wake up in her bed, wishing this was all a bad dream. But the rain didn't stop. The wind didn't stop. The sea had swallowed everything she knew. When dawn finally came, the sea began to quiet. The waves still moved, but slower now, gentler, as if they were tired too. The girl lay motionless on the floating piece of wood, her fingers still gripping it tightly. Her lips were pale, her eyes half open. The sun touched her face, warm but distant. She could barely see the horizon, only endless water around her. No houses, no boats, no voices, just silence and sea. A group of rescuers found her hours later, washed up near a small rocky shore miles away from her village. One of them lifted her carefully, thinking she might not be alive. But when her fingers moved slightly, hope returned to their faces. They wrapped her in a blanket and carried her to a nearby camp. She didn't open her eyes again for 2 days. When she finally woke up, everything was strange. The air smelled different, the sounds were unfamiliar. She saw people walking around, some crying, some silent. A kind woman leaned over her and gave her water. The little girl's lips trembled as she whispered one word. Mama. The woman didn't know what to say. She just stroked her hair and said softly, "You're safe now." But the girl didn't feel safe. The world she knew was gone, and the sea that once sang her to sleep had taken everything she loved. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of her story. The story of how she would one day learn to live again. Not as the girl who lost everything to the sea, but as the survivor who rose from it. When the little girl opened her eyes again, everything around her felt strange. The air smelled like smoke and wet wood. She was lying on a cot covered with a thin blanket, and her body ached as if she had run for miles. For a moment she didn't remember where she was or why it was so quiet. Then she heard the sound of crying. It was soft at first, then louder, the sound of many voices mourning at once. That was when she remembered. The storm.
The waves.
Her mother's hand slipping away. Her father's voice shouting in the distance. Everything came back like a sharp wave crashing inside her chest. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding, and looked around. There were tents made of plastic sheets, people sitting on the ground, and rescuers moving from one person to another with water bottles and food. The little girl stared at them, trying to find a familiar face, but none were there. Her small hands trembled as she touched her arm, the scratches, the bruises, the salt still clinging to her skin. A woman in a yellow vest noticed her and came closer. "You're awake," the woman said gently, kneeling beside her. "Don't move too fast. You've been very sick." The girl's voice was barely a whisper when she asked, "Where is my mother?" The woman's smile faded slightly. She looked away, pretending to fix the blanket. "We're still looking for many families," she said softly. "Rest for now." But how could she rest when everything she knew was gone? The girl looked past the tent opening and saw the sky, pale, washed out, and empty. In the distance, smoke rose where her village once stood. She could see pieces of wood, broken boats, and things floating on the muddy water. Her heart sank. It didn't look like her home anymore. It looked like a place the sea had chewed up and left behind. The rescue camp was crowded with survivors. Old men sitting quietly, mothers holding babies, children searching for their parents. Everyone had lost someone. The rescuers moved quickly, giving out food and blankets, writing names on notepads, calling out through loudspeakers. The girl didn't speak. She just watched. Sometimes people ran to the gates, shouting names, hoping to find their families. Sometimes they cried when they realized the person they were calling for would never answer. Days passed, though she couldn't tell how many. Her body healed slowly, but her heart stayed heavy. She would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, hearing the roar of waves in her dreams. Sometimes she'd sit outside the tent and stare at the dark water in the distance. She hated it now, the sea that once made her happy. It was no longer blue. It looked black and cruel. One evening, an older man at the camp sat beside her. He had lost his own family, too. He didn't talk much, but he shared a small piece of bread with her and said quietly, "We are still here, child. That means something." She didn't reply, but his words stayed in her mind. Every morning, rescue teams would announce new lists of people found, some alive, some not. The girl listened carefully each time, hoping to hear her parents' names. Each time she didn't, she felt a little piece of hope slip away. One afternoon, the woman in the yellow vest came back to her tent with a small notebook. "We're trying to find your family," she said softly. "Can you tell me your full name and your parents' names?" The girl told her everything she remembered. Her house, the blue paint, the chickens, the boats, even her favorite rock near the shore. The woman wrote it all down carefully and smiled. "We'll keep looking, okay?" The girl nodded, though deep down she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. That night, rain began to fall again. The sound of it made her body tense. She covered her ears, but she could still hear it, the steady tapping that reminded her of the storm. A volunteer noticed and moved her cot away from the edge of the tent. "You're safe here," the volunteer whispered. "No waves can reach you now." But the girl still couldn't sleep. Safety felt like a word that didn't belong to her anymore. A few days later, a group of government officials came to visit the camp. They handed out supplies and asked questions. The girl watched them from a distance. One of them, a kind-faced man, crouched down beside her and asked, "Do you know where your home was?" She pointed toward the direction of the sea. The man sighed. "Many villages are gone," he said quietly. "We will take care of you. You're not alone." She didn't understand what take care meant. All she wanted was to go home. But when they finally took her to what was left of her village, her heart broke. Everything was gone. The trees were twisted, the ground was covered with debris, and the houses were nothing but broken wood and mud. Her own house and the little blue one wasn't there anymore. Just a few pieces of it lay scattered across the sand. She walked slowly through the wreckage, her bare feet sinking into the wet ground. She picked up a small piece of wood, recognizing the blue paint from her porch. For a moment she stood still, holding it close to her chest. It was the only thing left from her home. She wanted to cry, but no tears came. It was as if the sea had taken even that from her. The rescuers guided her back to the camp before sunset. They didn't want anyone near the shore after dark. That night the girl lay awake thinking about her parents. She remembered her mother's voice, her father's laughter, the stories by the fire, and how safe she used to feel. She wondered if they were somewhere waiting for her, or if they had become part of the sea now. The thought made her chest ache, but she refused to let herself believe they were gone. Not yet. In the following weeks, the camp began to change. More tents were built, and children were gathered together for activities to keep them calm. The girl was quiet at first, but one of the volunteers gave her a small notebook and some crayons. "Draw whatever you feel," the woman said kindly. "Sometimes it helps." At first, the girl didn't know what to draw. But one afternoon, she picked up a blue crayon and began to sketch the sea. She drew big waves and small figures trying to escape them. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Each line felt like a piece of her heart spilling onto the paper. When the woman saw it, she didn't say much. She just placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "You're brave," she whispered. Slowly, the girl began to speak again. Her words were few, but they mattered. She started to help other children in the camp, especially the younger ones who were scared at night. She told them stories, simple ones her father used to tell, about brave fishermen and gentle waves. It didn't take the pain away, but it gave her a reason to keep going. The rescuers began moving survivors to safer places, away from the coast. The girl was placed with a kind couple who worked at a shelter home for children. They promised her she could stay until her family was found. The house was quiet and filled with other children who had lost their homes too. For the first time in weeks, she slept without hearing the sea. But even in her dreams, the ocean never really left her. She often dreamed of her mother calling her name or her father waving from the boat. She would wake up crying, clutching her pillow. Yet each morning, she forced herself to get up and help set the breakfast table. Life had to go on. That's what everyone kept saying. One day, the woman from the rescue camp visited her. She brought good news. A new school had opened for the children. "You can study again," she said with a warm smile. "Would you like that?" The girl nodded slowly. She hadn't thought about school in a long time, but something about the idea made her feel lighter. Maybe learning could help her forget even just a little. At school, she made a few friends. They didn't talk about what happened. They didn't need to. Their silence understood each other. The teachers were gentle, and sometimes they'd take the children to the nearby park to play. When the wind blew from the sea, the girl would freeze for a second, then breathe deeply and tell herself she was safe. Months passed. The scars on her skin faded, but the ones inside her stayed. She didn't smile as often as she used to, but she laughed sometimes, and that was enough for now. She started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build a new life. Not like the one she lost, but something different. Something still worth living. And though she didn't know it yet, the girl was becoming stronger with every passing day. The storm had taken her childhood, but it couldn't take her courage. Somewhere deep inside, she carried a quiet promise that one day she would face the sea again. Not as the scared child it almost destroyed, but as the survivor it unknowingly created. The days at the shelter slowly turned into weeks, and then into months. Life there was different, quieter, but it still felt like living in a place that wasn't really hers. The little girl had her own bed now, a small wooden one with a thin blanket and a window beside it. Sometimes, when the wind blew, she could still hear the faint sound of waves in the distance. It made her shiver. She would pull the blanket up to her chin and whisper to herself that she was safe, even though deep down she didn't believe it completely. The couple who ran the shelter were kind. They never raised their voices, and they always spoke softly. The woman liked to hum old songs while cooking, and the man fixed broken toys for the children. There were other kids there too, boys and girls of different ages, each carrying their own silent stories of loss. Some had lost their parents in floods, others in accidents. No one talked much about it, but everyone knew. In the beginning, the girl didn't speak at all. She would sit by the window holding her small blue-painted piece of wood, the only thing left from her old house. She kept it close like it was a piece of her heart. The others tried to befriend her, but she only smiled faintly and stayed quiet. One afternoon, the woman who ran the shelter placed a notebook and a few colored pencils on her bed. "Draw something for me," she said gently. "Anything you like." The girl looked at the pencils for a long time before touching them. At first, she just drew lines, unsure of what to make. Then, little by little, she began to draw waves. Not angry waves like the ones from the storm, but calm ones, soft and blue under a warm yellow sun. The woman smiled when she saw it. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "The sea looks peaceful here." The girl nodded slowly. "I want it to be like that," she said in a soft voice, the first full sentence she had spoken in months. From that day, she began to draw more often. It became her way of speaking when words felt too heavy. She drew boats, shells, trees, faces, and sometimes just lines that made her feel less alone. One evening, the man at the shelter fixed up an old radio that hadn't worked for years. When it crackled to life, everyone gathered around it. Music filled the small living room, soft and old, with voices she didn't know. The little girl sat quietly, listening. The songs reminded her of the days when her father used to sing while repairing his nets. For the first time in a long while, she felt something warm inside her chest. Not quite happiness, but something close. Every morning, she attended a small school run by volunteers. It was set up inside a nearby building where the walls still smelled of fresh paint. The teachers were patient and kind, and they treated every child like family. The girl learned slowly, often distracted by memories, but her teachers never scolded her. They encouraged her to try again, to believe she could do it. She liked reading stories, especially ones about people who faced hard things and still found their way. The stories made her believe that maybe she too could become strong. When she struggled with lessons, one of the teachers would kneel beside her and say, "You're doing fine. You've come a long way already." Those words always stayed in her mind. After school, she would sit under the old mango tree outside the shelter. From there, she could see the horizon where the land met the sky. She still didn't like looking at the sea, but she loved the sky. It made her feel free, like she could start over. Sometimes she imagined her parents watching her from up there, proud of her for not giving up. Seasons changed, and so did she. The nightmares came less often now. The crying stopped. Instead, she found herself laughing sometimes at silly jokes, at birds fighting over crumbs, at the way the younger children tried to chase butterflies. The laughter felt strange at first, but then it started to feel right. It was like the sound of her own voice returning to her after being lost for too long. One afternoon, a counselor visited the shelter. She was a gentle woman who spoke softly and listened carefully. She gathered the children in a circle and asked them to share something they missed and something they were thankful for. When it was the girl's turn, she looked down at her hands for a long time. Then she said quietly, "I miss my mother's voice, and I'm thankful for the people who helped me when I couldn't help myself." The room fell silent. Even the counselor looked moved. It was a small moment, but it was a sign that the girl was healing, slowly but surely. As the months went by, she began helping out around the shelter, sweeping floors, folding clothes, and helping the younger children with their homework. She found comfort in being useful. It made her feel alive, connected to something again. The couple often told her, "You're growing into a wonderful person," and she would blush and look away, not sure how to accept such kindness. One day, a group of visitors came to the shelter. They were part of an organization helping rebuild homes for families who had lost everything in the storm. They asked if she wanted to visit her village now being rebuilt. Her heart tightened at the thought. She had avoided going near the sea since the day she lost her parents. But something inside her said she needed to see it, not to remember the pain, but to understand it. The next morning, they drove her back to the coast. The air smelled of salt again, and the wind carried the familiar whisper of waves. When they arrived, she froze for a moment. The place looked both familiar and strange. New houses stood where ruins once were, and children were playing in the sand again. The sea was calm that day, almost as if it was sleeping. She walked slowly toward the shore, her steps hesitant. The memories came rushing back. The screams, the darkness, the cold water. Her chest ached and her eyes filled with tears. But this time she didn't run away. She stood there quietly, breathing deeply, letting the sound of the waves wash over her. It wasn't easy, but she realized something. The sea hadn't meant to hurt her. It was just doing what nature did. It gave and it took. That was its way. She knelt down, picked up a small shell, and held it in her palm. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she whispered. The wind seemed to soften around her, and the waves rolled in gently, touching her feet like an old friend saying hello. After that visit, she began to change even more. She started drawing again. But now her drawings were full of color and light. She drew children playing near calm seas, boats sailing under blue skies, and people rebuilding homes together. Her art began to tell stories of hope instead of loss. The counselors noticed and encouraged her to keep drawing. They even displayed some of her pictures on the shelter's walls. When new children arrived at the shelter, scared and silent like she once was, she would sit beside them and say softly, "It's hard now, but you'll be okay. I was scared too." Her calm voice comforted them in ways that words from adults couldn't. She understood their silence because she had lived in it herself. Over time, the girl grew stronger, not in the way of lifting heavy things or running fast, but in the quiet way of surviving pain. She still missed her parents deeply, but she learned that love didn't disappear just because people did. It stayed inside her in every act of kindness she gave to others. In every moment she chose to keep living. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, the woman who ran the shelter sat beside her. "You've come so far," she said softly. "Do you ever think about what you want to be when you grow up?" The girl thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I want to help people," she said. "Maybe help them learn how to stay safe when the sea gets angry. I don't want anyone to go through what I did." The woman nodded, her eyes full of pride. "That's a beautiful dream," she said. And it was. The girl didn't know how she would do it yet, But for the first time since the storm, she had something to look forward to. A purpose. She no longer saw herself as the child the sea took. She was the one who came back, the one who survived, the one who learned to find light even after the darkest wave. That night, as she lay in bed, she looked out the window and saw the moon shining over the distant water. It was the same sea that once tried to break her, but now it didn't scare her anymore. It shimmered quietly, calm and endless, like a reminder that even after destruction, beauty could return. She smiled softly to herself and closed her eyes, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. Years went by, and the girl who had once clung to a broken piece of wood in the middle of the sea was now growing into a young woman. Life at the shelter had shaped her in quiet but powerful ways. She wasn't the same scared child who used to wake up from nightmares and cry for her mother. She still missed her parents deeply, but she had learned how to live with that emptiness, not to erase it, but to carry it with grace. The world around her had changed too. The village she once knew had rebuilt itself slowly. New homes stood where ruins once were, and laughter had returned to the air. People still spoke about the great storm, but not with the same fear. It had become a story, something painful but also a reminder of how strong they could be. She too was finding her place in that new world. The couple who ran the shelter encouraged her to study, to dream, and to find something she loved doing. "You have a quiet strength," the woman often told her. "Use it to do something good." Those words stayed in her mind. She had seen what loss could do to people, how fear could break them and how kindness could bring them back. She wanted to be part of that healing for others. In school, she worked hard even though learning hadn't come easy at first. She often stayed up late with books spread across her bed, the little lamp flickering beside her. Every word she read felt like a step toward a new beginning. She wanted to know more about how storms worked, why they came, and how people could be better prepared for them. The sea had taken everything from her once, but maybe she could learn how to live with it, even help others survive it. When she finished school, she joined a community program that trained young people in disaster safety and response. The first day she walked into that small training hall, her hands shook a little. She saw maps on the walls, models of boats, and pictures of past floods. The memories hit her hard, but she took a deep breath and stayed. The instructors spoke about safety plans, rescue techniques, and how to help people during emergencies. Every word felt important. She listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions, and volunteering whenever she could. Some of the others noticed her quiet determination. "You seem like you've seen this before," one of them said jokingly. She just smiled and replied softly, "I have." As months passed, she became one of the best trainees in her group. She learned how to organize evacuation routes, distribute supplies, and comfort people during chaos. What made her stand out wasn't just her knowledge, it was her calmness. When others panicked during practice drills, she stayed steady. The leader of the program once told her, "You don't just work with your hands, you work with your heart." After her training, she started volunteering with local rescue teams. The first time she went out during heavy rain, she felt her body tense up. The sound of rushing water brought back flashes of that terrible day years ago. For a moment, she wanted to turn back. But then she saw children huddled under a tree, frightened and crying. And she remembered herself at that age, lost and alone. That memory gave her courage. She ran to them, helped them to safety, and stayed with them until the rain stopped. That night, as she lay in bed, she realized something. Facing the sea didn't scare her anymore. It gave her purpose. Soon, she began visiting schools and community centers, teaching others how to stay safe during disasters. At first, she was nervous about speaking in front of people. But when she started telling her story, not as a tragedy but as a lesson of hope, everyone listened in silence. Her voice shook the first few times, but by the end, she always saw the same look on people's faces, a mix of sadness and inspiration. They saw in her not just a survivor, but proof that even after the worst storm, life could bloom again. She traveled from one coastal town to another, sharing her message. Sometimes she met children who had lost homes, sometimes parents who feared losing their families to floods. She listened to them, hugged them, and told them that fear could be faced, that pain could become strength. Her words were simple, but they came from truth, and that made people believe her. In one small fishing village, an old man approached her after a talk. "You remind me of my granddaughter," he said, tears filling his eyes. "She was lost in a storm like the one you survived." The young woman placed her hand gently on his shoulder and said softly, "Then she lives through you and through me too." He smiled faintly, and in that moment, both found a little piece of peace they didn't know they still needed. Her work slowly began to get noticed. Local organizations invited her to join their awareness campaigns. She spoke on radio shows, shared her story at youth events, and even helped train volunteers. She didn't do it for fame. She did it because she wanted people to understand how fragile and precious life could be. Every time she stood before a crowd, she saw the faces of her parents in her mind, and it gave her strength to keep speaking. Despite all this, she still visited the old shelter whenever she could. The younger children there looked up to her like an older sister. They knew her story, and when they felt scared or hopeless, they would come to her room and sit beside her quietly. She never told them to stop crying or to be strong. She just let them feel what they felt, because she knew healing didn't come from pretending everything was fine. It came from allowing the pain to breathe. One evening, as she sat outside the shelter watching the sunset, the woman who had cared for her since she was a child came to sit beside her. "You've grown so much," she said softly. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" The young woman smiled, her eyes following the orange light fading over the horizon. "Sometimes," she said, "but I still feel like that little girl sometimes, the one the sea took." The woman placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Maybe," she said, "but that little girl is the reason this young woman exists. You've turned your pain into something that helps others. That's not what the sea took. That's what it gave back." Those words stayed with her. A few months later, she was invited to join a regional safety and rescue program, something she had dreamed of for years. It meant traveling farther, meeting more people, and taking on more responsibility. She hesitated at first, afraid to leave the place that had given her so much comfort, but deep down she knew she had to go. Growth often meant stepping into new waters. Her first major mission was helping train volunteers in a coastal town that had just suffered from another storm. When she arrived, she saw the same look in people's eyes that she had once seen in her own reflection, fear mixed with grief. She gathered them in a small hall and began to speak. Her words were simple, her voice steady. She told them about the night the sea took everything from her, about waking up alone, about the long road back to life. And then she said, "If you can still breathe, you can still build. The sea may have taken your homes, but it didn't take your courage." There was silence in the room. Then someone began to clap. Then another. Soon the whole room was filled with the sound of applause, not for her story, but for the truth inside it. People needed to hear that survival wasn't about never falling. It was about getting up, again and again, no matter how hard it was. That night, as she stood by the shore of that new town, the moonlight touched the waves, and she thought of her parents. She didn't cry this time. Instead, she whispered a thank you for the life they gave her, for the love that stayed alive inside her, for the courage she didn't know she had. The sea still roared sometimes, wild and unpredictable, but she no longer saw it as the enemy. It was a part of her story, the part that broke her, yes, but also the part that made her who she became. Now, when people asked her what she didn't just say she was a survivor. She said she was someone who helps others survive too, and that, in her heart, was the most beautiful way to live. Years had passed since she had first walked into that rescue program, unsure of who she was or where she truly belonged. The small, scared girl who had once been lost at sea was now a grown woman, calm, strong, and quietly brave. Her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined, but one part of her still felt unfinished. She had spent years helping others heal, yet she hadn't completely healed herself. There was one place she hadn't returned to, the village where it all began, where the sea had taken her childhood away. She thought about it often. Sometimes when she gave talks or trained volunteers, a memory would flash in her mind, the sound of her mother's laughter, the smell of the sea breeze that used to drift through their little home, the way her father would hum while fixing the boat. Those moments felt distant, like someone else's memories, but they were still hers. She had carried them like tiny lights in her heart. And now she felt ready to go back, not to relive the pain, but to finally face it. The morning she decided to return, the air was cool and quiet. She packed a small bag with only a few clothes, her old notebook, and a photograph that had somehow survived the storm. The only thing left from her family. It was faded now, the edges worn, but it was all she needed. She took the early bus that ran along the coastline, watching the view change through the window. Hills gave way to the wide stretch of ocean she hadn't seen in years. The sound of the waves reached her long before she arrived. When she stepped off the bus, her heart beat faster. The village looked different, yet familiar in strange ways. New houses stood where old ones had once been, and a small school stood near the edge of the beach. Children played outside, laughing, chasing one another through the sand, a sound she hadn't heard here in so long. She walked slowly, every step heavy with memories. The people she passed looked at her curiously, not recognizing her. But then how could they? The little girl they once knew was gone. In her place stood a woman who had crossed oceans of pain and somehow found her way back. She followed the narrow path that led toward where her family's old home used to stand. The small wooden fence was gone, and the trees her father had planted were taller now. The house itself wasn't there anymore. The sea had claimed it long ago. Only the outline of the old foundation remained, half buried under sand and grass. She knelt down and ran her fingers through the ground, feeling the cool earth beneath her palms. A tear slipped down her cheek, not from sadness but from something deeper, a mix of gratitude, longing, and peace. "This is where I started," she whispered softly, "and somehow I found my way back." She stayed there for a while, just listening, to the sea, the wind, the laughter of distant children. Then she stood up and walked toward the beach. The tide was coming in, gentle and steady. The water shimmered under the afternoon light, and for the first time in years she didn't feel afraid to look at it. She took off her sandals and stepped into the cool waves. The touch of the water sent a rush of memories through her, the chaos, the fear, the darkness of that night. But now it was different. The same sea that had once tried to take her life now felt calm, almost like it was welcoming her home. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I forgive you," she said softly, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to the sea or to herself. Maybe both. As she stood there, a voice called from behind. She turned and saw an elderly man walking slowly along the shore with a cane. His face looked familiar, though older and lined with time. He stopped when he saw her. "You've come back," he said quietly. She recognized him. He was a fisherman from the old village, one of the few who had survived the storm. His hair was now gray, his step slower, but his eyes still held the same kindness. She nodded, smiling gently. "Yes, it's been a long time." He studied her for a moment. "We thought you were gone," he said. "When we found that piece of wood days after the storm, we thought no one had made it." "I almost didn't," she replied. "But someone found me. They saved me." The old man nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "Your parents? They tried to protect you. Your father wouldn't leave the shore. He kept calling your name until the waves took him too." Her throat tightened. She looked out at the sea again, her eyes misting over. "I know," she whispered. "I think about them every day." He placed a hand on her shoulder gently. "They'd be proud of you. You've lived the life they wanted for you. One full of purpose." She smiled through her tears. "I hope so." They sat together on the sand, talking for a long time. He told her how the village had changed, how people rebuilt their homes, and how they held a small ceremony every year to remember those who were lost. She listened quietly, feeling a strange sense of belonging. Before leaving, the old man said, "Tomorrow we will light lanterns for the ones we lost. You should come. Let the sea see how far you've come." She agreed. That night she stayed in a small guest house near the shore. She lay awake for a while, listening to the waves outside. They no longer sounded threatening. Instead, they sounded like a lullaby, the same kind her mother used to hum. She smiled softly and drifted into sleep, her dreams peaceful for the first time in years. The next evening, the villagers gathered by the beach. The air was filled with the warm glow of lanterns, each one carrying a name, a prayer, or a memory. She stood among them, holding one small lantern of her own. On it, she had written just 3 words, "For my family." When it was time, she walked into the shallow water and placed the lantern gently on the surface. The light floated away slowly, carried by the waves. She watched until it became just a small dot in the distance. Around her, others were doing the same, their faces lit by the soft golden glow. The beach was quiet except for the sound of the sea and the soft murmurs of people remembering their loved ones. For her, it wasn't just a goodbye, it was a beginning. She finally felt that she could live without the shadow of that night holding her back. The sea hadn't taken everything from her. It had taken her past, yes, but it had given her strength, empathy, and a reason to live for others. Later, as the crowd began to leave, a young girl approached her shyly. She looked to be around 10, her hair tied in 2 messy braids. She held a small seashell in her hand and said, "My brother told me you're the lady who helps people when there's big rain." The woman smiled. "Yes, that's what I try to do." The girl hesitated, then offered her the seashell. "Can you keep this? My grandma says shells carry the voices of the sea. Maybe it'll talk to you nicely now." She took the shell gently, her heart full. "Thank you," she said softly. "I think it already has." As the girl ran back to her family, the woman looked down at the seashell in her hand. She held it to her ear and listened. The faint hum of the ocean whispered inside, soft, endless, alive. It no longer sounded cruel. It sounded like forgiveness. When she finally left the village the next morning, the sun was rising over the horizon. The sky glowed in shades of pink and gold, and the sea sparkled beneath it. She paused for a moment before boarding the bus, taking one last look. "I'll come back," she murmured. "Not because I have to, none but because I want to." And she did. Over the years, she returned often, bringing books, safety gear, and volunteers to help train the villagers. The children loved her visits, and the people called her the daughter of the sea, not because the sea owned her, but because she had learned to live with it. Her life became a story that others told, not about tragedy, but about resilience. She never saw herself as a hero, only as someone who refused to let her pain go to waste. And whenever she felt lost or tired, she would take out the little seashell the girl had given her and listen. The sea still spoke to her, not in storms this time, but in songs of calm, reminding her that even the deepest wounds can turn into waves of peace. And so, the child the sea once tried to take became a woman who learned to walk beside it, not with fear, but with love. The sea hadn't just tested her, it had taught her what it truly meant to survive.